Does America really have a godly heritage? Well, did you realize that out of the 55 founding fathers who worked on the Constitution, that 52 out of the 55 were Orthodox evangelical Christians? We don't hear that part of our history anymore. This 1856 Maryland history textbook contains a story about George Washington that you've probably never heard. It was a story of how his life hung in the balance for over 2 hours and how that only by the direct intervention of God was his life spared. We'll get to this story in just a moment. This 1856 Maryland history textbook contains a story about George Washington that once appeared in virtually every student text in America. We haven't seen it in the last 40 years. But this story deals with George Washington when he was a young man, only 23 years old. He was involved in the French and the Indian War. Now, the French and the Indian War happened about 20 years before the American Revolution, and it was the British against the French, and the Americans sided with the British, and most of the Indians sided with the French. Now, Great Britain and France have been arguing over who owned the colonies. They both claimed that they owned the colonies. They were unable to settle it diplomatically, so Great Britain decided to send 2,300 hand-picked veteran British troops to America with General Edward Braddock to chase the French out of America. Well, they arrived in America, in Virginia, and George Washington was the colonel of the Virginia militia. And he and 100 buckskins joined in with General Braddock to go chase the French out. They divided their force into two, and so General Braddock and George Washington and 1,300 troops marched north toward Fort Duquesne. Now, we now call that Pittsburgh, but then it was a French fort. They were marching toward that fort to expel the French from the region. They were 7 miles from the area. They were going through a wooded area, ravines, and they got ambushed. They'd walked right into an ambush, and the French and the Indians started opening fire on them from both sides. Well, these were British veterans. They knew exactly what to do. The problem was they were veterans of European wars. And in the European wars, what happened was you got out on an open field. One army got at one end, the other army got at this end. They looked at each other, they aimed at each other, and they fired. That was European warfare. It was all open. And here they were in the Pennsylvania woods, the French and the Indians up in the tops of trees and behind rocks and under logs. So when the British were open fire on, they started lining shoulder to shoulder in the bottom of the ravine, which led to a butchery. For over 2 hours, they were slaughtered in the bottom of that ravine. It was such a lopsided battle that at the end of 2 hours, out of the 1,300 British and American troops, 714 had been shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians had been shot down. There were 86 British and American officers involved in that battle, and at the end of the battle, George Washington was the only officer who had not been shot down off his horse. He was the only one left on horseback. Well, after the 2-hour battle, they retreated and went back to Fort Cumberland in northern Maryland. And when they arrived there on July the 17th of 1755, and the next day, George Washington wrote his mother and his brother a letter telling them about the battle. And those letters were contained in the textbook. And Washington told them, he said, after the battle was over, he said, I took off my jacket. He said, and I had 4 bullet holes through my jacket, but not a single bullet had touched me. He said, when I brushed my hair, he said, I had bullet fragments in my hair, but I'd not been scratched. He said, I had several horses shot out from under me, but I was not harmed. He said, God's hand was on me, God protected me, and God kept me through that battle. Now, that's an interesting story, but that's not where it stops. The text continues to go on and say that 15 years later, now time of peace, 1770, that George Washington and a close personal friend, Dr. Crick, returned to those same Pennsylvania woods. And an old Indian chief from far away, having heard that Washington had come back to those woods, traveled a long way just to meet with Washington. He sat down with him face to face, and over a council fire, he told Washington, he said, you don't know me. He said, but 15 years ago, you and I were in this woods together. He said, I was the chief in charge of the Indians you were fighting that day. He said, we saw you riding through the woods, knew that you were one of the leaders, and knew that if we could kill you, we could scatter the troops. He said, so I told my braves to single you out and fire at you. He said, I personally fired my rifle at you 17 different times. He said, when we saw that none of the bullets were having any effect on you, he said, I told my braves to stop shooting at you. He said, I've traveled all this way just to meet the man that God would not let die in battle. Now, that's an amazing story. Couldn't you enjoy American history with stories like that? Well, that's the way American history textbooks used to be. There's so many things that we don't hear anymore. For example, Patrick Henry. We're told now that our founding fathers are atheists, agnostics, and deists. Well, look at this statement by Patrick Henry. Now, we know Patrick Henry, he's famous now for the statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." But in old years, he was famous for a different statement. The statement he made was this. He said, "It cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ." Now, that's a strong statement. That's not very pluralistic. That's right to the point, and that's what used to appear in the textbooks. An indication of that would be this book from March of 1813. It's by the American Tract Society. Now, the American Tract Society still exists today in Garland, Texas, and they publish gospel tracts and gospel literatures for soul winning, for evangelization. Well, they existed in the early 1800s, and in March of 1825, they decided they would take all their tracts and bind them together into one volume. This is volume 1 of the American Tract Society tracts. And as you go through this, it's fascinating to read the tracts and to read the Bible verses and to read the messages they have. But it's even more fascinating to see who it was that was writing the gospel tracts. The same men that signed our founding documents were writing tracts for the American Tract Society. And as you get into the beginning of the book and look at the executive board of directors for the American Tract Society, you find that the American Tract Society was started by the founding fathers, as was the American Bible Society, as was the Philadelphia Bible Society, as was the Christian Constitutional Society. So many other groups that still exist today in America were founded by the founding fathers. Well, another famous founder was John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams was an early president. He spent 18 years in the House of Representatives. He was Secretary of State. He had a whole list of accomplishments. But before we look at what he said, I want to look at education as it was at the time of the founders. This is a textbook from 1795. It's called the New England Primer. Now, the New England Primer was first introduced into America in 1690, and for 200 years, this was the textbook of America's schools. If you went to schools in America, you learned to read from the New England Primer. We would now call it a first grade textbook or first grade reader, but they didn't have grade levels then, so they called it a primer. Now, as you get into the primer and look at what was taught in America's schools for 200 years, they start out with the alphabet, and they go through the alphabet, and they show students how to make 1, 2, and 3-letter syllables and how to put those syllables together to make words. And then about a fourth of the way through the book, they come back to the alphabet. And this time they take the alphabet and they add a phrase to each letter of the alphabet, and the students memorize those phrases. Now let me read you the phrases that comprise the alphabet of America's schools for 200 years. Notice that every one of these phrases is a Bible verse. It says, A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. B, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. D, do not the abominable thing which I hate, saith the Lord. E, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And right on through the alphabet. Now that was the alphabet of America's schools for over 200 years. And as you got on into some of the lessons, notice one of the lessons. Who's the first man? Who's the first woman? Who's the first murderer? Who's the first martyr? Who was the first translated? Who was the oldest man? Who built the ark? Who's the most faithful man, the meekest man, the most patient? Sounds like a Sunday school lesson. That was a lesson in America's schools for 200 years. And as you got into the back of the book, there were several questions here. And remember, this is first grade reader, first grade questions. Questions like this. What's the fifth commandment? What's forbidden in the fifth commandment? What's the reason annexed to the fifth commandment? What's the sixth commandment? What's required in the sixth commandment? What's forbidden in the sixth commandment? Right on through. Now that was the foundation of America's schools for 200 years. Now think of John Quincy Adams. He went through this type of educational system, as did all the founding fathers. But imagine this. When John Quincy Adams was 14 years old, under this system of education, he received a congressional diplomatic appointment overseas to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia. Can you imagine sending a 14-year-old overseas to represent the United States in Russia? It's hard to imagine today, but that was typical for that time, that type of education. Well, this is a statement that John Quincy Adams made. He said, the highest glory of the American Revolution was this, that it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. Now notice what he said. He said the biggest victory we won was that now Christian principles and government will be tied together in an indissoluble bond, never to be separated. But today we hear that it's just the opposite, that they wanted separation. No, that's not what the founders said. As a matter of fact, this next statement is by John Jay. Now, John Jay is the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Our first Chief Justice, he's one of the 3 men most responsible for the Constitution. And look what our first Chief Justice said. He said, Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty
as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers.
Now, how long has it been since we've heard the Supreme Court say, make sure you elect Christians in this next election? We haven't heard that in years. But did John Jay know what he was talking about? Yes, he's the original Chief Justice. He's one of the three men that gave us the Constitution. And he said that we should elect Christians for our rulers. Well, that was not a limited sentiment. As a matter of fact, this is a textbook that contains George Washington's farewell address. Now, students were taught in these textbooks that George Washington's farewell address was the most significant political speech ever given to the nation. Why not? He's the father of the country. He spent 45 years of his life in public service, everything from commander-in-chief through 2 terms as president. He's the man who was president of the convention that gave us the Constitution. He's the man that was president of the United States who called for the First Amendment Bill of Rights. He's the man who oversaw the formation of the First Amendment Bill of Rights. And now, after 2 terms in office, he says, America, this is what has brought us to this point. This is what we have to do to keep going. And yet that farewell speech hasn't been seen in most textbooks for nearly 30 years. Why not? Doesn't Washington have anything to say anymore? No, the problem is what he says, because in the last half of this farewell speech, Washington goes into great detail about something.
He says, of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars.
Well, those are the type of statements that we don't hear much anymore, but those were the statements of America's founding and America's history. Now, our founding fathers have delivered to us a system of government that has been remarkably successful. We're over 200 years under the same document, the same piece of paper, the same Constitution, and that's almost unheard of for contemporary nations. For example, take France. France, in the last 200 years, has gone through 7 completely different forms of government. Italy is now in its 48th form of government. We're still in our first. That's amazing. Where did our founding fathers get the ideas that have caused us to last so long when other contemporary nations can't last that long? Well, that was a question asked by political science professors at the University of Houston. They wanted to see where the founding fathers got their ideas, and they felt, very rightfully so, that if they could collect some of the writings of the founding fathers and see who the founders were quoting, that they would know where they got their ideas. So they collected 15,000 writings of the founding fathers. From that, they boiled it down to a group of 3,154 writings that they felt had significant impact on the founding of America. And they went through those writings looking to see who the founders quoted. It took them 10 years, but at the end of 10 years, they had found all the quotes of the founders. They knew who the founders had quoted, where the quote came from. They found that the 3 men quoted most often in America were Blackstone, Montesquieu, and John Locke. Now, that's a tribute to those 3 men.
But what they found that they did not expect was that 4 times more often than the founders quoted Montesquieu, 12 times more often than they quoted Blackstone, and 16 times more often than they quoted John Locke, the founders quoted directly out of the Bible. 34% of all quotes of the founding fathers came out of the Bible.
And on top of that, another 60% of their quotes, they were quoting men who had used the Bible to arrive at their conclusions. For example, I mentioned that Blackstone was one of the 3 men the founders quoted most often. This is his work, Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law. This was first introduced in America in 1758. Now, this is the 1889 version, but for 160 years, this was the law textbook of America. You couldn't go to law school in America without knowing Blackstone. This was the Bible for lawyers. The Supreme Court quoted from this regularly to settle disputes and to define words and to look at procedure. Where did Blackstone get his ideas? Well, think of Charles Finney. Now, Charles Finney is like the Billy Graham of the early 1800s. He was in the middle of one of America's greatest revivals. He was a revivalist, an evangelist, a preacher. But Finney didn't start out having a call from God that he felt to be a minister, to be a preacher. No, he wanted to be a lawyer. So he did what all other law students did. He entered law school and he studied Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law. And in the process of studying Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law, every time it gave the laws, it gave the Bible verses on which the laws were based. So much so that in the process of studying to become a lawyer, Charles Finney became a Christian in the process of studying to be law. That's hard for us to imagine today. But does that tell you where Blackstone got his ideas for law? They found that out of the quotes of the founders, 94% of the quotes of the founders were based on the Bible. 34% came directly out of the Bible, and another 60% were based from men who had used the Bible to arrive at their conclusions. Now, that leads to a lot of interesting things that we have in our government now. For example, we've got things that make us very unusual for other nations in the world. We established 200 years ago three branches of government. And those three branches of government that our founders set up were quite unlike any other nations around them. They didn't copy Britain's, they didn't copy France. Where did they get the ideas for our three branches of government that we have now? And on top of that, when the Founding Fathers established those three branches, they put in constitutionally guaranteed separation of powers to keep each branch away from the others. Well, the idea for the three branches of government came from Isaiah 33:22. And the idea for the separation of powers the founders found in Jeremiah chapter 17. The ideas that have been so unique that has caused America to last for so long were ideas that the founders took directly out of the Bible. For example, another one, tax exemption for churches. The founders gave tax exemptions to churches at their early days. Well, that's unheard of today. We still have tax exemptions, but you go to our closest northern and southern neighbors like Canada and Mexico, they don't give tax exemptions to churches. So where did the founders come up with an idea like tax exemptions? They found it in Ezra 7:24. It's amazing to read the early records of Congress and see how many times a congressman came onto the floor of the House or the Senate and said, look what I found in the Bible. They would discuss it on the floor of the House and the Senate, they'd vote on it, and they'd put it in the government with a statement that said, well, if it's in the Bible, that's what we want in our government. Now that's the type of heritage we have, but we don't hear much about that anymore. Do you know, the favorite book quoted by the founders, the book quoted more often than any other books, was Deuteronomy? Now, Deuteronomy is not your light reading book. That's not your devotional type book. They were students of the Bible. They were students of the Word, and they even knew the tough books. Now, this was so well understood in the early years that the Supreme Court continued to rule in that intention, keeping God's rules at the basis. For example, notice this case from 1892. Look what the Supreme Court said. It said, our laws and our institutions must necessarily be based on and must include the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind. That's a strong statement. And they continue. They said it's impossible for it to be otherwise. In this sense, to this extent, our civilizations and our institutions are emphatically Christian. Now, what would lead the court to that conclusion? Why would they come to such a strong conclusion that the teachings of Christ had to be in everything that we did, that we're emphatically a Christian nation? Well, that case, it was not long. It was only 16 pages long in court history. But it gave 87 different historical precedents to prove that. They quoted the Founding Fathers and the Acts of the Founding Fathers and the Acts of the Congresses, the Acts of the State Convention. They got to the end of 87 and the court said, now we could keep going like this for a long time, but 87 is sufficient to say that our laws and our institutions must be based on and must include the teachings of Jesus Christ. Now remember those 87 precedents. We'll come back to that a little later because the court, when it makes decisions, it bases its own precedents. The court will go back and look and see how it had ruled in previous cases, and it uses that as precedents to try to continue forward to be consistent in their rulings. Now, this next case is a case from 1844, and it came out of Philadelphia. There was a school in Philadelphia that said, now we're going to teach our young people morality, but we don't need religion to do that. We can teach them to be moral without religion. Sounds just like schools today. They said, we don't need Christianity to the Bible. We can teach morality without it. That was such an unorthodox position at the time of the founders that this case made the Supreme Court. And look what the court told that school in Philadelphia. The court said, yes, you're going to teach your young students morality.
They said, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament?
Now, the court ruled you couldn't have a school that didn't teach Christianity in the Bible because that was the source of morality, and we hear just the opposite now. Now, this case from 1811 might even seem to be strong for us, but notice what the court said. It says, whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends to destroy civil government. Now, that case dealt with a man who really got mad. He got irate. When he got irate, he went into a profanity fit. Profanity wasn't the problem. It was what he said when he got profane. And not only had he said it, he had written it all out and distributed it and passed it around. And the court looked at what he'd said, and it contained it in the court's records, and it said, Jesus Christ is this, Jesus is this, God is this, the Bible is this. And he'd gone through a whole string of accusations against Jesus Christ and against the Word of God. Well, the court summed that up, and they said, no, that's blasphemy. And the court said, the problem with the blasphemy is this. The court said, if you attack Jesus Christ, you've attacked Christianity. And the court said, if you've attacked Christianity, you have attacked the foundation of the United States. The court said, therefore, an attack on Jesus Christ is equivalent to attacking the United States. That man got 3 months in prison and a $500 fine for attacking the United States by going after Jesus. That's almost hard to imagine today. But notice the date on that case. It was an 1811 case, nearly 2 decades after the First Amendment was in place. The First Amendment never intended to separate Christian principles from government, but yet we hear separation of church and state so often today. As a matter of fact, we hear it so often that in recent polls, 67% of the nation said that they thought that the phrase separation of church and state was found in the First Amendment. And that's despite the fact that the words separation, church, or state don't even appear in the Constitution. Well, where did we get that perception of separation, church and state? Well, to look at that, we have to go back and look at our origins. Most people know the phrase, but few people know its origins. And you really have to start by looking at the First Amendment. When the First Amendment was framed in Congress, when they went through and arrived at the wording that we have now, and the First Amendment very simply says now, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Notice the words separation, church, state, they're not even found in the First Amendment. Well, what's the history and background of the First Amendment? Where did separation of church and state come from? Well, the background of the First Amendment is very clear as to what the intent of Congress was, because before they passed the wording that we have now, they went through 12 different iterations, and those iterations make the intent clear. For example, some of the earlier versions said, Congress will make no law establishing one denomination of Christians higher than another denomination. Congress will make no law respecting one society more than another society of Christians. The intent was clear. We do not want in America what we had in Great Britain. We don't want one denomination running the nation. And that's what they'd had in Great Britain, whether it was just the Catholics or just the Anglicans. They said, we don't want a repeat of that in America. We do want God's principles, but we don't want one denomination run the nation. Now, that was so well understood that even court rulings several years after the First Amendment made that very clear. For example, this is a case from 1796, and look what the court says. The court says, by our form of government, the Christian religion is the established religion, but all sects and denominations of Christians are placed on the same equal footing. Well, again, that's clear. We do want Christian principles, we do want God's principles, but we don't want one denomination to run the nation. Now, that was understood long after that. But the phrase, separation of church and state, where did it come from? Well, it came out of an incident that happened in 1801. In 1801, the Danbury Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut, heard a rumor that the Congregationalist denomination was about to be made the national denomination of America, and that distressed them, and it should have. So they fired off a letter to President Thomas Jefferson. They expressed their concern. January the 1st, 1802, Jefferson wrote to that group of Danbury Baptists, and in his letter, he assured them, he said, the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation between church and state. He said, but that wall is a one-directional wall. It keeps the government from running the church, but it makes sure that Christian principles will always stay in government. Now, all we hear of his speech anymore is just half the speech, that the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation. Well, he made it very clear that God's principles are to stay in government, but the government's not to run the church. And that was the definition of the First Amendment, was to protect the church from the government, not vice versa. Well, as time progressed, there was no national denomination established, so his speech fell into disuse. And then in 1853, another group came to Congress with a petition. And they petitioned Congress. It was a small group, and they said, we want a separation of Christian principles from government. We want separation of church and state. Well, that petition was referred to the House and the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they investigated for 1 year to see if it would be possible to separate Christian principles from government. At the end of that year, they came back with a report, both the House and the Senate. Now, I'll show you versions from the House report. The Senate was very similar. But the House report said this. It said, had the people during the Revolution had a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. That's strong. If the Founding Fathers had thought they were doing anything to limit Christianity, the revolution would have died. And the report continued. They said at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and its amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one denomination. And they continued. They said, in this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. And then later, they made this strong declaration. They said, the great, the vital, the conservative element of our system, the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and the divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They said, there's no way we're going to separate, because that's what's made us so successful. That's been our foundation, our base, our root. Well, as time continued to progress, there was another challenge in the late 1800s, in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. There was a group that specifically challenged Christian principles in government. And so as that challenge progressed through the courts and through the legal system, it arrived at the Supreme Court, challenging Christian principles in government, saying there shouldn't be that. Well, at that time, the court went back. For example, in the 1878 case, Reynolds versus the United States, they went back and pulled out Jefferson's letter in its entirety. And they gave it again, and they said, yes, Jefferson did say there was to be a separation of church and state, but he said that was to protect the church from the government. He said, notice that Jefferson also said that Christian principles were never to be separated from government. And the Supreme Court used Jefferson's letter for the next 15 years to make sure that Christian principles stayed part of government. Well, it remained that way until 1947. And in 1947, for the first time in the court's history, it used only 8 words out of Jefferson's speech. In the case called Everson versus Board of Education, the court said this. It says, the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. Now, that was the first time that it had been reversed in America. Always before that, the First Amendment was to protect the church from the government, but now the court said, no, the First Amendment is to protect the government from the church. There's a high wall there. We can't allow any breaches. Now, that was a new philosophy for the court. And what would have allowed the court justices to say that and to arrive at that? Well, they were influenced by a man named Dr. William James. He's called the father of modern psychology. And he was a strong opponent of religious principles in government and education. He wanted religious principles separated completely. And he made this statement. He said, there's nothing so absurd but that if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. And that's the tack that the court began to take in the following years after 1947. They began to talk about separation. They said, this is what the founders wanted, separation of church and state. This is the great intent of the... They didn't quote the founders, but they just said that's what the founders wanted. Well, they continued on that track so long that in 1958, in a case called Bear versus Cole Morgan, one of the judges was tired of hearing about it. And he wrote a stinging dissent. He said, if this court doesn't stop talking about separation of church and state, he said, someone's going to think it's part of the Constitution. And that was his warning in 1958. But the court continued to talk about it. They continued to talk and talk and talk until 1962. In 1962, in the case called Engel versus Vitale, is the first time in America's history that we had a ruling that separated Christian principles from education, Christian principles from government. That was the case that removed school prayer. Now, we know that's the first time in America's history that religious principles were separated by legal research. But on top of that, the World Book Encyclopedia for the next year, the 1963 World Book, said that that case was the first time that we had had separation of church and state. Do you realize that that doctrine is a brand new doctrine? It's not something from the founders. It's not an original doctrine. That's something that even outside observers know started just in recent years. But yet look how much we've lost in those recent years under that brand new doctrine. Now, that case that removed school prayer, it was interesting in a number of aspects. One was, you remember I told you that 1892 case used 87 precedents to say that this is a Christian nation and the teachings of Christ have to be in everything we do? Well, this was the first case in court history that we'd seen like this 1962 case. The court gave 0 precedents. It quoted 0 previous legal cases. It gave 0 historical incidents. It simply made an announcement. It said, we'll not have prayer in schools anymore. That violates the Constitution. Without historical or legal base, a brand new direction in America. Well, within a 12-month period of time, by June the 17th of 1963, in 2 more cases called Abington Shemp and Murray Curlett, the court had completely removed prayer, Bible reading, religious classes, religious instruction, and that was a radical change. For example, to show you how radical it had been, how recent it was, this is a book from 1946, and it says Bible study courses of the New Testament for Dallas high schools. You look on the inside, and it says that it's authorized by the Board of Education April the 23rd, 1946. It's printed in the Dallas Public Schools print shop, and as you get into the introduction, you find that this is a course for graduation from Dallas high schools. Well, it wasn't a bland course on the New Testament. Notice some of these. This is the first lesson. Lesson 1 says, the pre-existence of Christ. Where was Christ before he was born on earth? What titles does John apply to Christ in this chapter? For what purpose was John sent by God? The Annunciation, birth, and infancy of Jesus. Name 5 things the angel told Mary concerning her child Jesus. What does the word Jesus mean? How did the angel explain the miraculous births of John and Jesus? And right on through the lessons. And at the end of lesson 1, there's some memory work. Memorize the pre-existence of Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And right on through. Now, that was in 1946. So what happened in 1962 and 63 was a radical reversal of everything that we'd had prior to that point. Now, that 1963 case, the Abington Shemp case, is the one that removed Bible reading out of schools. And if you think back just over the brief survey that we've done here, you recall that 94% of the quotes of the founders were based on the Bible. You recall the early textbooks quoted the Bible, used it as part of the alphabet. You even recall earlier legal cases we've looked at where the court said you couldn't have a school that didn't teach Christianity in the Bible. how in the world can the court justify in this 1963 case removing the Bible out of schools? Well, the court never makes a decision without explaining its decision, and you can go to a law library and check out the text of the case and read it, just like you would in a book in a regular library. And this is what you'll find in that 1963 case, Abington Schimpf. This is the court's explanation of why the Bible had to come out of schools. The court said that if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could have been and had been psychologically harmful to the child. And that's quite a statement. The Bible has to come out of schools because it causes psychological damage for children. That's a brand new statement. Again, this was another case without historical base, without legal base. It said no more Bible reading in schools. That causes psychological damage for the students. Well, the whole controversy has started over this little prayer. This little prayer is a 22-word prayer that led to the removal of all prayers across America. This was the prayer of the Engel Vital case, and it very simply says, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings over us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Now that prayer only acknowledges God, doesn't even contain the word Jesus in it, and that prayer was so bland that 8 years later, when the court was talking about that prayer, the court said that that prayer was a to whom it may concern prayer. I mean, that's bland. If somebody's up there, if you happen to be listening, I think we're praying. That type of prayer, even described by the court. Well, that little bland prayer was interesting for a number of reasons. It acknowledged God. One time, it was declared unconstitutional. Do you realize the Declaration of Independence talks about God 4 times? And this prayer that just mentions God once is unconstitutional? And furthermore, this prayer merely acknowledged God, and the court went so far as to find out what percentage of the nation did believe in God. And in the 1963 case, Abington Schimpf, the court said in that case, they said at that time only 3% of the nation professed no belief in religion, no belief in God. 97% of the nation believed in God. That prayer was consistent with the beliefs of 97%, but the court took another first. Said we side with the 3% against the 97%. And that was the first time in America's history that 3% had become a majority. 3% had always been a minority, but now the philosophy of the 3% would be the philosophy under which the 97% would conduct their business. Well, if you look at the 4 categories in that prayer, it talks about students, it talks about families, it talks about schools, and it talks about the nation. And in all 4 of those categories, we have numbers of Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court used to rule in all 4 of those areas using biblical principles following God's guideline. For example, in that area dealing with families, we have 20th century cases dealing with divorce in which the courts explain that they only allow divorce for a few reasons, and that the reason they only allow divorce for a few reasons is because the Bible only allows divorce for a few reasons. And the court explained. They said, you have to understand, we didn't make the family, God did. Therefore, we don't have a right to regulate something we didn't make. We simply take God's rules and apply that to the family the same way God did. And the court then went into a Bible lesson. The court said, now remember, in the beginning, God made Adam and Eve. God made the first family. And then it continued on through the history. And it said by the time you got to Noah and the flood, it said God took Noah and his wife, and He put them in the ark. That was one family. God took their 3 sons, the 3 wives, put them in the ark. God put 4 families in the ark. Here came the flood, wiped out the world. When God took them off the ark, He took 4 families off. And the court went through a history of how God had created the family and pointed out that since God had created it, they used His rules in dealing with the family. But now we arrive at 1962-63, and the court says, no, 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 we're not going to use those rules anymore. They cause psychological damage. So we want to see if that made any difference. Does it make a difference to stop ruling by God's principles, to stop conducting life by God's principles? Well, let's look at each of those 4 categories. Let's start with students. What happened to students when we removed religious principles? Well, this statement by George Washington is really good. Washington says, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. He says if you take away religious principle, you're going to lose national morality. Well, did that happen? Well, remember that in 1962, the court took out prayer. In 1963, it took out Bible reading. The court continued step by step by step. In 1965, in a case called Reed versus Van Hoven, the court said, now, it's okay for students to pray over their lunch at school. No problem praying over their lunch as long as no one knows they're praying. They can't say any words, they can't move their lips, but they can pray if nobody knows about it. 1967, in a case called DeKalb versus Spain, the court took a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class, and the court said that's an unconstitutional nursery rhyme. And the court explained. They said, now, although the word God is not contained in this nursery rhyme, they said if someone were to hear it, they might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. Continues on with case after case. But let's get to 1980. In 1980, there were 3 cases that made the Supreme Court challenging the right of students to see the Ten Commandments while they were at schools. Now, the court said the Ten Commandments were passive displays, and what that means is they were hanging on the wall, just like a picture of George Washington, like a picture of Jefferson, just a framed copy of the Ten Commandments hanging on the wall. You look at them if you want to. If you don't want to, that's fine. It's not part of class. It's not part of curriculum. They're just there hanging. And the case that the court took was Stone v. Graham out of Kentucky. And in the schools of Kentucky, in the hallways, they had a copy of the Ten Commandments hanging in the passing ways and the hallways of the schools. This is what the court said about the Ten Commandments in 1980. The court said if the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read them. And if they'll read them, they'll meditate on them. And if they meditate on them, they'd respect them and obey them, and that would be unconstitutional. That's quite a statement. You can't see the Ten Commandments. You can't let kids see the Ten Commandments, because if they do, they might obey it. Things like don't steal, don't kill, that's unconstitutional. Do you realize that if the Ten Commandments had come from anyone else, if they'd come from Plato or Aristotle or anyone else, they'd still be allowed in schools. But simply because they came from the Bible under the new doctrine of separation, they're not allowed in schools anymore. Well, when the court says something is unconstitutional, what they're saying is our founding fathers would have opposed this. They would not have wanted this. It's unconstitutional because they would not have wanted it. Look at what James Madison said. Now, James Madison is the chief architect of the Constitution. He is the single man most responsible for what we have in the Constitution. And look what he said about the Ten Commandments. He said, we've staked the whole future of American civilization, he said, not on the power of government, far from it. He said, the future of America is not in this new document, it's not in the Constitution. He said, we've staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of each and every one of us to govern ourselves according to the Ten Commandments of God. Madison, the man most responsible for the Constitution, says the future of America is not in the Constitution, it's in obeying the laws of God. If we don't obey something as simple as the Ten Commandments, the Constitution's not going to work. Well, back to what Washington said. Washington said if you remove religious principle, you're going to lose national morality. Was that really right? Well, look at this chart. This shows teenage pregnancies for girls in school. Notice where teenage pregnancies had been for years. Notice the removal of religious principles. Notice the loss of national morality. Now, that chart shows girls 15 through 19 years old, and for girls 10 through 14 years old, teenage pregnancies have increased 553% in America. You go to another chart, and that chart is sexually transmitted diseases among students. And look what's happened to students. You see where sexually transmitted diseases had been? You see the removal of religious principles. You see the loss of national morality, how it just shoots through the top. Let's go to the next category over which we'd acknowledge God, that of our families, that of our parents. What happened when we stopped using God's laws and dealing with families? Well, let's look at divorce. Each one of these gray blocks represents 3 years, so I backed up 15 years to show you what had been happening in America. For 15 consecutive years, divorce had been declining in America. And then in 1963, we say, no more. We're not going to use God's standards to deal with families. And between 1963 and 1983, the number of divorces in America tripled every year starting in 1963. Every measurement related to the breakup of the family starts in 63. Single-parent families are now up 140%. Single-parent families with children up 160%. Even family morality is dramatically different. Unmarried couples living together up 353%. Let's move to the third category over which we had acknowledged God, and that was our schools, our teachers, our educational systems. What happened when we took God out of schools? We took His principles out of schools. Well, this chart shows SAT scores, and SAT scores is such a good test to look at, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, because it has been in America since 1926. 1941, we put it on the same scale we use today, and look what happened to the scores. They had been stable for years, and then we took God out of schools, and the scores went on a sudden decline. Prior to 1963, there had never been more than 2 years in a row where the scores either went up or went down. But in 1963, they went 18 consecutive years in a row of decline. Unprecedented. Never had that happen before. Scores are so low now that the Department of Education says this is the first time in America's history that we're graduating out a generation of students who academically know less than their parents did, because it's the same test their parents took. It's the same since 1941, and yet look at the difference between the two generations. Now, on that chart, in 1974-75, the chart took a marked turn. It had been declining very sharply, and in 74 and 75, it began to slow down, and it actually turned back up in 80 and 81. And we thought, now, if taking God out of schools is the reason that it's declined, why would it go back up? God's not back in schools. Well, we went back to the Department of Education, and we found at that time that 74 and 75 is the year in which private religious schools started exploding all over the nation. Christian schools began an explosion. For example, in 1965, there were only 1,000 Christian schools in the nation. And why not? With textbooks like there were in Dallas public high schools, that was almost being a Christian school. But by 1974, Christian schools started to grow in America, and by 1984, there were 32,000 Christian schools in America with 8.5 million students attending private religious schools. Now, 8.5 million, that would have an impact on scores if the students coming out of those private religious schools had scores higher than the students coming out of public schools. We went back and investigated the SAT, and according to the SAT board responsible for the SAT test, the scores of students coming out of private schools are nearly 100 points higher than those coming out of public schools. 100 points higher. Do you know where that is? That is the same point that scores had been prior to 1963. For those private religious schools, it's as if no change had ever occurred. But for public schools, their scores are still continuing to decline. Had it not been for the impact of those private religious schools, scores would be moving downward. Now, another indication of the impact that religious principles and religious educational schools have had on America is found in the academic cream of the crop, the nation's academic elite called the National Merit Semifinalists. That's the top 0.5% of the nation's students. That's the very top academically. Now, we wanted to see out of all those students, what percentage came from private religious schools and what percentage came from public schools. The Department of Education says that of all students attending school, 12% go to private religious schools, 88% go to public schools. Now what that means is that little group of 12% of the students should give you 12% of the nation's cream of the crop, the nation's academic elite. 88% of the nation's students in public schools should give you 88% of the nation's cream of the crop. What we found was not even close to that. As a matter of fact, that little group of 12.4% of the nation's students in private religious schools produced 39.2% of the nation's top academic scholars. That's 3 times larger than its size. That's phenomenal differential. We showed that to a U.S. congressman. He looked at it and he said, that makes perfect sense to me. He said, when you're talking about private schools, he said, you're talking money, you're talking affluency. He said, private schools ought to get better scores than public schools. We went back to the Department of Education for that same year and found that the average private school cost $1,100 per student. The average public school cost $3,752 per student. Private schools, 1/3 the funds, turning out 3 times the percentage of academic scholars. And what's the fundamental difference between those 2 types of schools? You look at public schools, you look at private schools, the core curriculum is the same. Civil War takes place the same at both schools, the same year. Math is the same at both schools. A verb is not an adjective because you transfer to a private school. The basic difference is one utilizes religious principles, one does not. And that appears to make a 100-point difference on the SAT test. Now the final category, the 4th category, what happened in the nation when we took away God's principles? What do you think happens when you start telling students, you can't see the 10 Commandments, you might obey that. Don't steal and don't kill. That's got to have an impact on the nation. Well, indeed it did. Look at violent crime. Increased 544% since the removal of religious principles. Now, the best explanation of that I've ever heard came from Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson said the reason that Christianity is the best friend of government is because Christianity is the only religion in the world that deals with the heart. For example, in the Old Testament, the law says, thou shalt not kill. You get over the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus in Matthew 5 says, I'm not telling you don't kill. He says, I'm telling you don't hate. Well, if you take care of the hate, you prevented the murder. The law, the Old Testament says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Get over the teachings of Jesus. Jesus says, I'm not telling you don't commit adultery. He says, I'm telling you don't lust in your heart. Well, if you take care of the lust, you prevented the adultery. And the founders pointed out that Christianity was the only religion that could stop crime before it started because all crime came out of the heart, and if you didn't deal with the heart, you would never deal with crime. And that's why Christian principles were so valuable. Now, most of the founders had statements that I could have quoted, but I just chose this one from John Adams. And Adams pointed out that there was no government in the world big enough to make you do what's right. If you don't do what's right out of your heart, if you don't do what's right from the inside, government can't make you do what's right. By the time they get there, the trigger's already pulled, the knife's already in. They can't stop crime. You have to stop crime by dealing with the heart. Well, notice a statement from John Adams. He said, there is no government armed with power which is capable of contending with human passions if those passions aren't bridled by morality and religion. There's no way government can make you do what's right if you don't do what's right yourself because of morality and religion. Then look what he said. He said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Now notice what the founders believed. The Constitution would work for people who had internal restraints, internal controls, who would use the Word of God as their standard. Well, we've moved away from that, and we see that the Constitution is not working the way it should apart from religious principles. We've seen that on all the charts and the statistics. Now, as we look at things like that, we see how far America has slid. That kind of challenges us because we think, well, America's been a world's leader. We're always a world's leader. It's hard to think of us as not being a world's leader. Well, we still are a world's leader. As a matter of fact, since 1962, 63, we've become #1 in the world in violent crime, #1 in the world in divorce, #1 in the Western world in teenage pregnancies, #1 in voluntary abortions, #1 in the world in illegal drug use, and #1 in the Western world in illiteracy. Among all industrial nations, we have the highest illiteracy rate. At a White House briefing, we were recently told that just 3 years ago, 700,000 students graduated from high school who were unable to read their own diploma. In that 1 year, 700,000 students, after 12 years of school, unable to read their own diploma. Well, looking at the list of categories that we now lead, Jeremiah 6:16 has good advice. It says, if you want the ways of peace, it says, go back to the old paths. Well, what were the old paths? What were our roots? Well, after the Founding Fathers had declared themselves independent from Great Britain, the next task they faced was that of establishing state governments. We didn't have state governments that were independent. They were all British-run and crown governors. So when the Founding Fathers went back to establish their state governments, look at the requirements that the Founding Fathers put in their state constitutions. Now, there were 13 states at that time, and at the time the federal constitution went into effect, 11 of the 13 states had written their own state constitution. Government was still so new that 2 states hadn't gotten around to writing a state constitution by the time we had the federal constitution. But look at the requirements the Founding Fathers put in those state constitutions to hold public office. This is out of Delaware. The other states were very similar. It says, everyone appointed to public office must say, I do profess faith in God the Father and in the Lord Jesus Christ, His only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God and blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. And that's the requirements to be a politician. That was the requirements the Founding Fathers set up. But notice that's consistent with the First Amendment because it did not require you to be from one denomination to hold public office. It didn't say you had to be a Methodist, a Lutheran, a Presbyterian, or Baptist. It did say you have to understand God's principles. You have to understand the Word of God to hold office here. Now, the reason for that, they explained very clearly on the floor of the Constitutional Convention. You see, there was a third requirement that appeared in the state constitutions, and it said that every public official must acknowledge a belief in future rewards and punishments. He must acknowledge that he understood that when he left office, he would be accountable to God for what he'd done while in office. He wouldn't just answer to the voters, he would answer to God for what he'd done while in office. Well, we understand that idea of accountability. We understand that we will stand before God and answer for what we do. When will we answer? Well, who knows? We're eternal beings. We have souls. We have spirits. Maybe it's tonight. Maybe we'll answer in the morning. Maybe we'll answer 10,000 years from now, but we will answer. There's no way around it. Individuals will answer to God. We are accountable. But does a nation answer to God? Well, the Scripture clearly teaches that it does, and the Founding Fathers believed that it did. And this conversation went on the floor of the Constitutional Convention talking about how that a nation is different from an individual. When does a nation answer to God? For an individual, it might be in the future. But how about a nation? A nation doesn't have a spirit. It doesn't have a soul. When a nation dies, it is dead. That nation is no more. God is not going to resurrect the United States 10,000 years from now and say, why in the world did you say that the Bible causes psychological damage? That's the type of statement you answer for, but when do you answer for it? Well, this is what the founders said. They said, as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, so they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. You see, they felt like that God would deal with the nation right now based on the stance that it takes now because a nation has no other time to answer to God. And that's why you'll notice that in 62 and 63, when we told God He was no longer welcome in the public affairs of the education of the nation, all the charts break dramatically at that point because God deals with the nation based on its stand. Now, that was a principle they understood and they discussed. For example, they pointed to instance in the Bible, Elijah. You take Elijah, who after he had his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel, he won. He went out to Mount Oreb and he told God, Mount Oreb, he said, God, get me out of here. I'm the only one left. There's nobody in the nation that believes in you. And God said, no, no, no. He said, there's 7,000 men left in this nation, men of integrity, men who love me, who have not bowed their knee. They're righteous men. Okay, so we accept that. But do you know what was going on in that nation? Ahab and Jezebel were the leaders. They were wicked leaders. And because of the wickedness of the national leadership, because of the bad stands taken by the national leadership, the entire nation, including those 7,000 men, went for 3.5 years with no rain. You see, God had to deal with the nation based on the stands of the nation's leaders, despite the fact there were righteous individuals in the nation. Another example given was that of David. When David decided to number his troops, he'd won so many victories, and he came to the point where he thought, man, I win victories. I am just a really strong king. I want to see how big my armies are. And his general Joab said, David, don't do that. He said, God is the one who has won the victories. Don't get to the point where you think you're winning the victories and that you want to see how big your army is. And David said, no, I want to know how big my army is. I want to know how strong I am. Well, that was a bad stand for a nation's leaders to say, God, you haven't won the victories. We've won the victories. As a result of that stand by David, the leader of the nation, a plague came on the entire nation, and in Jerusalem alone, 70,000 people were wiped out as a result of that plague. You see, the nation suffers for the results of its leaders, and that's why the founders were so emphatic about keeping men in office who understood God's principles, because in the most famous speech ever delivered by Benjamin Franklin, he said, we need God to be our friend, not our enemy. We need Him to be our ally, not our adversary. We need to make sure that we keep God's concurring aid. He said if a sparrow can't fall to the ground without God noticing it, how do we possibly think that a nation can rise without His aid? And so he called for regular, daily prayer to make sure that we kept God alongside what we were doing in the nation. Well, this principle of national accountability was understood by all the founders. As a matter of fact, here's a statement from the inside of Jefferson Memorial. Jefferson made this statement. He said, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice can't sleep forever. Again, the same theme. The nation does answer to God for what it does. And even 100 years later, at the time of Abraham Lincoln was asked by a newspaper reporter. They said, President Lincoln, do you think God's on our side in this battle? Is God on our side in the Civil War? And Lincoln's statement showed he understood this principle. He said, sir, my concern is not whether God's on our side. My great concern is whether we're on God's side. Now, that's a completely different perspective. And they understood that they needed to take stands as a nation that lined up with what God wanted so that God's blessings and concurring aid, as Franklin said, would be on the nation. Well, that's been our heritage, that's been our history, and this has been a little segment that we've looked at here. But Benjamin Franklin made a statement that really sums up what has to happen in America. He made the statement in 1774 when he was ambassador to France. Now, we already had this in America. He was recommending this for France. He said, whoever will introduce into public affairs the principles of Christianity will change the face of the world. He said, you want to be a world's leader? He said, you put Christian principles in your public affairs. Well, we talked about Finney earlier. Look at this statement by Charles Finney, and look how appropriate it is for us today. Finney said this. He said, the church must take right ground in regard to politics. He said, politics are part of a religion in a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. Now notice what he said. He said, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. Now why is that? Can a nation be blessed apart from God's principles? No, it can't. But where do God's principles reside? They reside in the hearts of God's people. If God's people do not make it into office, God's principles do not make it into office. Ungodly people will not take godly principles to run a nation. And that's why the church has to take right ground. That's why the founders were so emphatic about keeping Christian men in office. From the Supreme Court Justice all the way through the state constitutions, they emphasized that. Now, as you look at that aspect, and you look at how important it was to keep Christian people in office and how that God will only bless the nation under godly principles, we have to realize that we need to get involved. Now, there's a scripture in Proverbs 18:1 that's very good. It says, a man who isolates himself seeks his own desires. He rages against all wise judgment. You cannot be isolationist. You can't say, I'm not going to get involved. The founders used to teach their young people. They said, young people, you want to do something good for God? Be a senator, be a judge, be a congressman, be a doctor, be a lawyer, be a missionary, be a pastor. Get out there where you can affect people with God's principles. Well, in the 40s and the 50s, we began to say in America, young people, you want to do something good for God? Be a missionary, be a pastor, but don't get involved in politics. And when we started getting out, we handed the system over to ungodly principles. Now, we've got to get involved again, and we have to come to grips with the fact that separation of church and state, it's not a teaching of the Founding Fathers, it's not a historical teaching, it's not a teaching of law until just the past few years, in recent years. And we've also got to realize the separation of church and state is not a biblical teaching. Do you realize what separation says? Separation says, okay, Christians, we recognize that you're the light of the world. Just don't get out of the church. Don't shine on anything out of the church. Christians, we recognize that you're the salt of the earth, but just don't get out of the shaker where you might mess something up. See, separation of church and state says you can be salt and you can be light, but only right here. That's not even scriptural. You can't do that scripturally. And we also have to understand the fact that there is going to be someone's religion in school, there is going to be someone's religion in government. For example, in 1963, in a case called Torcaso-Watkins, and again in 1986, the court ruled that secular humanism was a legitimate religion equivalent to Christianity under the law. It's a viable First Amendment religion by the court's rulings. And it very simply has a philosophy that says God has no place in our philosophy. This is a philosophy based on man, not on God. Okay, we accept that. That's a religion. 1977, the court, in a case called Theriault versus Silber, said that atheism was a religion. Now, how can you say atheism is a religion if they don't even believe in God? And the court pointed out that whatever you believe with all your heart, whatever affects the way that you act, whatever you believe so strongly that it changes the way you act, that's your religion. So what's the religion of atheists? Well, the religion of atheists, the thing that affects the way they behave, is that they believe with all their heart there should be no religious practice. Therefore, the religion of atheism is the religion of practicing no religion. Now, in recent years, we've also had rulings from the court that have declared satanic activities, Wiccas and covens and satanic groups, a legal organized religion, equivalent under the First Amendment to Christianity, so that people who give contributions to those satanic groups get the same tax deductions as people who give contributions to Christian churches. Okay, we accept that. But when do we hear separation of church and state? Have you seen anyone go into a school at Halloween and say, wait, get those witches down off the walls. Separation of church and state. I demand separation. That's a legal organized religion. Have you seen anyone go into public schools and say, no, wait, I don't see any prayer here. I don't see any Bible reading here. There's no religious practice here. That means it's the religion of atheism. I demand separation of church and state. Get the religion of atheism out. No, we don't hear that. When do we hear separation of church and state? Anytime there's an attempt to involve Christian principles, that's the big club that they pull out to beat Christians back. Separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is not part of our history. It's not part of our law until recent years, and it's not biblical. Now, we have lost ground. We have a godly heritage in America, and we have lost ground in recent years. We have been robbed, and we've been robbed by the 3%. The 3% has taken away our heritage, and we've lost sight of it. We have to get involved and take back our heritage. That's the roots of America, that's the foundation of America, and the church has got to take right ground. We've got to go forward with Christian principles and get the things back that we've given up in recent years. We have to get involved.
You've had just a glimpse of what's available to you through WallBuilders. David Barton has written a number of powerful books that are reaching a lost generation today. America, to Pray or Not to Pray, clearly reveals how far America has fallen since the Supreme Court banned school prayer. The Myth of Separation shows that the popular widespread concept of separation of church and state is not constitutional. And the exciting new title, The Bulletproof George Washington, tells the full, unforgettable story of George Washington's escape from death. David's booklet, What Happened in Education, covers the decline of America's schools, and his newest book, Did Television Cause the Changes in Youth Morality, will give you shocking new insights into America's favorite pastime. These and other materials are available to you through WallBuilders, Post Office Box 397, Aledo, Texas 76008. Or you may call 817-441-6044 for more information. David Barton is speaking around the country to thousands who want to know what has happened to our godly heritage. If you'd like David to make a presentation to your church or civic group, write or call today.